Hello, and thank you everybody for joining us today. My name is Wesley Peters. I'm the Vice President of Conduct and Creativity, where our focus is innovation, literacy, and entrepreneurship. Thank you to Pyramid Art Books and Custom Framing and Hiring Fine Arts, as well as Kenneth Avery, Words of Kavery, for doing this with us today. Is Black History Month. We really wanted to focus on the topic that we're going to bring you. I'm not going to be before you long, but thank y'all for joining us. So yeah, I kind of just want to tell y'all a little bit about my friend Kenneth Avery. When I got to UCA, I was just taken aback by just the work that he would put in. You would see a lot of people do random events and do stuff kind of just to do it, whether it be for popularity or because everybody else just was doing stuff. But KJ was actually doing events that meant something to me. And so I was just drawn to, the light that he was bringing. So I want to read his bio real quick. It's real short. Kenneth Avery Jr. Is a Stuttgart, Arkansas native, UCA alumnus, and educator. Very good educator at that. He is currently a graduate student at Temple University and studying Afroecology and African American studies. So without further ado, I would like to hand this over to Kenneth Avery Jr.
All right, thanks, Wesley. Thanks for having me. Shout out to Conduct and Creativity. Shout out to Pyramids for hosting this great event. I really think we're going to have some great conversations. Also, Wesley, let me know if my sound started acting up. But first, I just want to start off by talking about the event a little bit, about the Neo Renaissance and the search of the talented 10. Um, so conversations like Du Bois's essay on the talented 10th in 1903 brought forth many conversations surrounding what was next for the black community regarding higher education and industrial education as they lifted themselves out of slavery. There was a strong plea for the higher education of black people, which those who were interested in the future of the freedmen could not afford to ignore at the time. W.E.B. Du Bois, born in Massachusetts and was an American sociologist, socialist, historian, civil rights activist, and Pan-Africanist, believed that to attempt to establish any sort of system of common and industrial school training without first providing for the higher training of the very best teachers is simply throwing your money to the winds. From Du Bois's point of view, this idea of the talented 10th scholarship wasn't for the individual, but for the uplift of the entire community. With booming economies across the North and Midwest offering industrial jobs for workers of every race and more tolerant racial conditions, many black people relocated to cities in the Midwest and North, and Harlem and Manhattan drew nearly 175,000 African Americans. With having some of the brightest minds and talents of the time in their area, they produced one of the most significant areas of cultural expression in the nation's history. Literary and arts expressed by black folks is specifically named the Harlem Renaissance, which was deemed the spiritual coming of age, stretched far beyond Harlem into Los Angeles, Cleveland, and other places where black voices were also documented throughout their art, literature, music, dance, and other diverse types of artistry. 100 plus years later, we want to honor the trailblazing efforts and the spirit of the Renaissance by posing the conversation in search of the talented 10th. I see this as an opportunity to critique those ideas as well, which I hope some of our panelists will do today. So next, I want to introduce our three panelists. We had one person say they wouldn't be able to join us today, but we were able to bring someone else, another brilliant scholar that I know, to be amongst us. So here we go. So first, we have Toya Stewart. Toya Stewart has more than 25 years of global telecommunication and marketing experience under her belt. Toya has a unique ability to detect unmet needs, promote innovation, redesign business models, and utilize technology to achieve in her endeavors. Next, we have Tariq Richardson, known as Marlimu Tariq by his students, is a PhD candidate in the Department of Africology and African American Studies at Temple University. His area of interest are Afrocentric theory, historiography, and societies within the African cultural paradigm. He currently teaches a course on African civilization at Temple University. Next, we have Courtney Carr. Courtney Carr is a PhD student in the Department of Africology and African American Studies at Temple University. She received her Master's of Arts degree in Pan-African Studies from Syracuse University and a Bachelor of Arts degree in Africana Studies from Cornell University. Courtney's research interests include non-governmental organization discourse, transnational feminisms, and unpacking narrative formulations about women impacted by female genital cutting. All right, so we're going to jump right into it. And so I'm going to ask a few questions to our panelists, and I'll give each of them time to respond. And after they respond to the questions that I pose, we will have a question and answer session. So feel free to put any questions to the host. So I think Wesley will have those questions. And you can also add any conversation or anything you have to say to the discourse in the chat box. So feel free to talk in the chat box and respond to what our panelists are saying. All right, so our first question is, and I'll start off with Toya, to Tariq, then to Courtney. Um, Based on what you know about the talented 10th, was this idea forward thinking for people of African descent? And or do you see this as limiting or counter liberatory?
So I will have to say for me, I think it was a misinterpretation. So I think it was progressive in terms of creating a dialogue. I think how we interpret some of that dialogue has caused some of the confusion. I think there's been some progression that's come out of it in terms of those who are in leadership kind of feeling responsible for moving the community forward. But it also stated in the Talented 10, that's a community activity, right? So it was really talking about how do you train those men and women that are going to be courageous enough to go out and do those things that the masses may not be able to do because I might be at home with my children, whatever the case may be, the scenario. So what are those great women and men? What are they doing? And not only that, what have they continuously done to the progression? So a part of the Talented 10 essay was actually about showing the progression of those men and women in that conversation. So from that perspective, I also think it was progression in that because we sometimes forget that there is a group of Black people that we don't necessarily see that are in universities, that are in institutions, that are doing that behind the scene work that really does have an influence on community. So I think it was really speaking to those individuals more so, and in terms of their relationship to the community issues. Make sense?
Yeah, got it. Thank you for that, Toya. Tariq, what about you?
So I agree. I think there's been a lot of misinterpretation with the Talented 10. Through this misinterpretation, people have taken it as some kind of elitist call to action. I think when we look at the Talented 10, what he's saying is that this minority within the Black community have a duty, and I think this is the part that gets misinterpreted, to rise up the entire community. So everyone's saying, okay, so all the responsibility is in this social, economic, or educated elite. And that's not really what's happening. Really what the Talented 10th is a call to action to those people to play their part, right? And it's such a critical role that we know there's so many obstacles in social advancement in this country or in Western countries. There's so many obstacles to getting education, right? At least the degrees that we want to talk about that come along with, being educated. And so what he's saying is the people who are able to find that level of relative success, you have a responsibility to give back to the community, right? We're rooting this back into like Sankofa mentality, right? And it makes me think of when you're nation building, right? Because, Du Bois, maybe he was a Pan-Africanist, maybe less of a Black nationalist. But when you talk about Black nationalism, we're talking about this idea of building a nation, right? You can't have a nation if everybody's farmers, or you can't have a nation if everyone's intellectuals. You need this diversity. You need everyone having their hands on deck, right? And that's really what we're looking at. It's a call to action to people who have been able to maybe get more access to resources than the average person in our community has. And really, when you look at the Talented 10, because he's saying 1 out of every 10 people in the Black community have access to these things. When you look at what's going on right now, it's not that much different. I think it might, if you look at how many people on average in the White community have a college degree, I think it's maybe 18 to 20%, right? So it's a little bit more, but still nowhere we're so far behind other ethnic groups, right? And we see how much money and resources and just other types of services that educated people in these other communities give back to their own community. So I really think there is a misunderstanding, as Sister Toya just said. And I do think that it's something for us to at least consider nowadays. I think a lot of us are very dismissive of these kind of notions, but really, I think we should be very critical of why are the people that we consider the social elite not giving back, right? Why are they not participating in this activity of being a talented 10th, right? If they are so talented, where is the responsibility in that talent?
Thank you, Tariq. Thank you. All right, Courtney, would you like to add?
Yeah, I kind of want to bring us into that critique that was unpacked about the talented 10th being a replication of elitism, because I think that given the time period that Du Bois was doing a lot of his writing, right, those early 1900s, a lot of what he was saying made sense because only a small segment of the Black population had access to even create, right, and create institutions, et cetera, et cetera. However, I really like to complicate it, especially if we put it into the context of our contemporary world. We can empower the masses through that 10th in so many ways, right? And I think it's so easy for that quote unquote talented 10th, or now technically, if we're going with Tariq's statistics, the talented 1/5 in our contemporary world, it's so easy for them to be sung the lullaby of when they get to those higher places, conceding to institutions of power such as capitalism, and almost being lulled by the elitism. And so, although I appreciate everything that Du Bois was saying at the time, I don't know if I can call it wholly liberatory. I don't think at all it was counter liberatory. I think that would completely be a stretch. It was really amplified. It had an amplified impact at that time. But I think that sometimes when people get to those higher positions, they can forget the people at the bottom, even if they themselves came from the bottom. And so I think that it's really important to complicate, if you do get to that talented 10th position, how are you making sure you aren't stuck looking at the view from the top?
Thank you, Courtney. Thank you for that. That was really good. And also going forward, let's try to keep it to 2 minutes. I forgot to say that in the beginning, just so we can get to some of the questions that people may have in the audience. Also, Wesley, some people may be trying to get in, so be sure to check if people are trying to get into the event. So my next question that I want to pose is, how dangerous is the concept of institutionalized thinking? How has controlled thinking helped or hindered the overall progress of Black people? So I'm thinking this question is more so talking about thinking within the academy, like within the only thinking within the academy and not thinking within the community as well. How is that? How is that type of controlled thinking that may be controlled by, white people in power? The things they give you and tell you is knowledge and education. How has that hindered or helped Black people, Toya?
So you would ask me first, right? You would do that. And so I meant to say earlier, I like to have fun. So then you have me on the phone, Wesley, with all these college educated professors. So we're gonna have that conversation afterwards as well. But actually, it's an interesting question. I am a person who is actually very, very much against institutionalized thinking. I think it's very damaging to people, right? I'm a diversity advocate, and even within the Black community, right? We need voices, everybody's voices, children, elders, women, men, everybody has to have a voice. So from that perspective, very much into diversity of conversation. I think the complexity we comes into, and even taking it back to Du Bois, is how do you do that the diversity that we do have, right? Courtney spoke of earlier, the early 1900s, but what else did you have blooming in the early 1900s? You had all this artistry coming out, you have all these fraternities and sororities, you have Black churches moving in a certain way. So everything is moving towards this kind of group think around these ideals, right? That somewhat have us separated, but in reality, we're all trying to use this idea to get us to the promised land, so to speak. Some think through education, some things through God, some think through, you know, organizing ourselves and having things like the NAACP and these other institutions where we can collectively pool our resources to fight for just whatever that is, right? So for me, I'm again biggest advocate. I think that the complexity comes in how do we make that happen, right? So everybody, we have this one integrated plan. And so they were speaking about earlier about nation building, which is what Du Bois was, you know, talking about Pan-Africanism as well as, you know, being pro-Black, so to speak, wanting things to be in our favor, to so to speak. Yeah, you gotta have to deal with the diversity of the community, which is always a complex issue.
Thank you, Toya, for that. Tariq?
So when we talk about institutionalized thinking, I think it's important to specify what institutions are we talking about, right? Because institutions aren't the problem, right? Black folks, we have our own institutions. We had our own institutions before we came to this country. What we're talking about are white supremacist institutions, right? And when we're talking about white supremacist institutions, really we can talk about the university as a factory of producing people who think within a white supremacist mindset or a framework, right? And when I'm thinking about these institutions and thinking about it in this way, it makes me think about accommodationalism, right? And like we're just trying to get by so that we can get ours, you know, so we can survive, right? And that is a strategy, right? But at the time that Du Bois created this idea of the talented 10th was around the same time that Booker T. Washington was talking to audiences. He was trying to get funding for institutes like Tuskegee, right, a Black institute to educate Black people. But he was talking to white people and asking for their help, right? And he was trying to accommodate to them, right? He said, I'm going to create this institution, but it will be within the same framework that you're dealing with, right? And that's what Du Bois called the Missouri Compromise, right? And they called him an accommodationalist. And so really the issue with this kind of institutionalized thinking is that it's not a revolutionary act, right? Going into these places is not a revolutionary act, right? What you're doing is you're not trying to dismantle white supremacy, or you're not trying to dismantle European patriarchy. What you're trying to do is insert yourself so you can get an equal piece of that power, right? And at the end of the day, those social hierarchies are going to exist, right? So when we're looking at things like Black studies, which certain institutions or exist in certain institutions as revolutionary spaces, right? We have to look at how do they get there in the first place? And what does it take for them to stay as a revolutionary program or a revolutionary space? Because we see again and again, so many of these spaces fold to accommodate, you know, these institutions. And then when they accommodate these institutions, then you have people just trying to get by and losing that critical edge.
Okay, thank you, Tariq. That was really good. And I really liked how you specified about, you know, some of these things being counter-revolutionary or not revolutionary in general. Courtney?
I'm so glad Tariq mentioned Booker T. Washington, because it made me think about this talk we were having in one of our classes recently, where we talked about his dichotomy of superficial versus substantial, right? And I think that what institutionalized thinking has the power to do is leave us at the superficialities of contribution, of learning, of so many things, right? We think that merely by putting something on paper, it's going to reach the masses, but it's not going to unless we act, unless we do something substantial, right? One of our professors talked a lot about the importance of building institutions. We talked a lot about institutions already, but physically giving space to Black people to facilitate these conversations, right? A lot of the Black Panthers, for example, they were utilizing spaces to meet that they did not own. And so a part of that substantiation that takes it beyond the superficialities of institutions is bringing us towards actually having ownership of these spaces where we're not solely conversing, but we're engaging in amplified ways.
Thank y'all. That was good, and I definitely had to jot down some notes so I can ask questions at the end. So the next question I have, I'm gonna go with Tariq first. In the wake of education systems and universities wanting to take away Black studies, we see that's happening even in Arkansas. How can Black people use this time to teach our own, share, tell our own history? And I think that goes back to the idea of not depending on the academy in a way, not depending on certain systems that educate us, that aren't built by us.
Right. So I guess I'm gonna do a little story time because what Courtney said about these spaces has got me thinking about the history of Black studies. Right. So we know about the student protests that happened on the West Coast in California, but before that, and then even after that, there were battles being fought. Right. And part of this, like I said before, was just to get into the institution. But what many people found out was just being in the institution is not enough, right? We have, we're talking about 10%, 20% doesn't matter. Most of our people are not in these institutions. So what you had was the insurgency in the schools bled over naturally into the community, right? And the support base for any decent Black studies program has to be from the community. And so in that way, the people who broke away from the African Studies Association and created the African Heritage Studies Association would be the same people, led by people like John Henry Clark, would be the same people who would create an organization like ASCAC, the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilization, which is a grassroots community-based organization aimed at the study of African culture from a Pan-Africanist perspective, which reaches Black people in space and time, right? Same thing with the Department of Africology at Temple University, where they realized that there are certain types of programming that you cannot do in these institutions. So they created the Malefe Kete Asante Institute, or they created Afrocentricity International, organizations to reach the people in the community and do the things which at a university, you're going to have to ask the dean for permission. You're going to ask the president. And 9 times out of 10, those people are not necessarily on our side or even on the same page, right? So maybe they write it off, but they don't really know what's going on. They don't have a vested interest. The people in the community do. So these community organizations are linked to any of these really good Black studies programs. And I think any academic, any person who's not invested in the community isn't worth their weight in salt. And I think we should be very wary of their intentions.
Great. Toya?
So just I guess as Tariq said, a little bit of story time for me as well, just to kind of give perspective. When I was in college in the early 90s, I went to a white institution where we didn't have Black studies, right? So what we did was we created our own through study groups. Then we started teaching lectures every week. We did that, and then we created a culture in the community whereby we would take those experiences that we know the university was not going to give us, and we began to do that as a part of our talented 10th, really truly give back, because that's the foundation, right? Most of us are first generation college students, still learning about ourselves in an environment, which most environments are like that, whether you go to HBCU or PWI, just to be quite frank. We're not teaching people the proper information about who we are, where we come from, so that we have the necessary pride and upliftment and inspiration that we need the masses to have to feel like they have a right to do these things, right? So when you're talking about studies and programs, and we need to look at definitely working with institutions like a Temple. I had a few friends that went through the African American studies programs there, but that institution has been very committed to that conversation, right? Then how do we take individuals, groups? You mentioned John Henry Clark. there's a whole library of books that they'll never probably reprint. And if Black people don't figure out how to do something with that, you're going to lose a whole bunch of history from people who really used to study. They didn't go on Google, like they did the research, they went to the continent, they, you know what I'm saying, they have original writings, things of that nature. So getting Black people into the understanding that that's our history and that's our responsibility, right? And then how do we help the educators? How do we help those in higher education to tell a more holistic story that just doesn't start as slavery and end in emancipation of Martin Luther King, right? So that's a global conversation that you got to get us to understand. It matters, and not just the fact that we, built the pyramids and we had gold. Like, that's not it. Like, what is the spiritual, mystical things? Like, how do you build the pyramids and you don't have a book, a ruler? Like, you know what I'm saying? So where's the science and the depth in that? That's what history should be giving us. And so I think this is a great time, to your question, for us to figure out, how do we relearn, right? How do we go back and fix some of those things that we missed? And again, these institutions and organizations and literary groups play a big part in that, and trying to connect the community, I think, is what Conducting Creativity is doing here. This conversation that we're doing here is like, how do we get all on a page where the masses will digest it? Because I can't feed a baby steak. I can't do that. you know what I'm saying? So that's kind of my little 2 cents on it.
That was great. Thank you so much, Courtney.
Yeah, I think to connect the stories that both Tariq and Toy shared about the importance of these programs and how they've just contributed historically, what they've done is allowed us to understand that history has been a lie, right? Or like history as we conceived it is just an entirety of a lie. And so it's so important for us to push back against what we conceive to be our knowing of the past, because the way that we are told or interpret the past pushes into how we interact with our present and our future, right? And so, for example, the point made earlier about how did they conceive the pyramids when they didn't have a ruler, that made me think about this concept of fractals that I just love talking about because I'm a bit of a nerd, but there's this thing called fractals that this mathematician, Ron Eglash, talks about, where African indigenous communities before, communities that don't adhere to what we conceive as civilization, which is already a complicated notion, but these indigenous communities, they built their housing in a way that infinitely replicated itself. So for example, if you had 2 homes next to each other, then the next homes would infinitely replicate itself outward in a way like that. And the way that he was articulating it was that in many ways, when this is analyzed, it is quantum physics, right? And so what did it mean that a pure conceptualization from a mind in an indigenous community is quantum physics? Because historical interpretations of what quantum physics is relegates it to whiteness. But I think when we re-articulate what history is, we understand that our existence is a degree of quantum physics.
Yeah, you ate. Thanks for that, Courtney. All right, I'm going to move on to the next question. It's pretty long, so feel free to ask me to repeat it, or if you missed something. Um, the Harlem Renaissance was a time period of intentional and unintentional connection for Black people across the diaspora. On one end, migrations fueled by racial pride and the unwillingness to be treated less than post-World War made it so Harlem and places of light became a place of uplift. Harlem was also a place of restrictions, in so much Black people were tenants. Black performers were discriminated against, and Black businesses struggled, even in the heavily populated Black community. How can we today learn from the pride in self, but also make the necessary moves to unbind ourselves from the white narrative? So thinking about finances, literacy, art, technology. I'm gonna go with Courtney.
Dang, I knew I was coming up in the order.
Yeah, you was
So I'm going to use the framing of finance, literacy, art, and technology and think through more like specific ways in those genres that we can untangle from the white narrative, because I think that like there are just a laundry list of ways that we can get past the white narrative. So if I think about finance, I think about ways in which we have to resist against capitalism, thinking through ways in which capitalism in itself was built off of the backs of enslaved bodies, particularly enslaved African bodies, right? And so it's really important to resist against capitalism and its law, right? For example, I'm thinking all the time about the J.R. Smith clip. I'm sure a lot of people saw it, where he was like, we have to have an Afrocentric mindset and we can't exist within capitalism, right? He was telling his peers like not to be capitalistic. And so that's one way. Finance-wise, I think for literacy, we just have to reconsider what we think literate to be. And I think that's just the thread for all of the themes you mentioned, right? Literacy, art, and technology, like all of these things just have to be reconceptualized in terms of what's being prioritized as valuable. For example, in art, right? We don't consider graffiti to be art, but I'm like, wait, have y'all seen some of these graffiti artists? They're doing some magic in what they're illustrating, right? But a Eurocentric narrative has taught us to think that graffiti is a crime, that you should be fined for it. But it's such a amplification of Black expressionism, seeing how they're etching themselves onto these spaces. And I think if we think of graffiti as this way in which like Black people are metaphorically making space for themselves, like that is such a pushback against the white narrative that thinks about Black bodies in confines. Graffiti is like, no, we're going to put this art in a space where you don't want it to be. And so I think that's a few examples of ways that we can unbind from the white narrative.
Thanks so much, Courtney. Tariq.
So I'm trying to remember what the question was, but my response to it, I think, would be the same either way I interpret it. When we're looking at the Harlem Renaissance, you know, the art, the community is important, and I think what has been lost is the ownership, right? Because we still have the community, we still have the art, but the difference is back during the times of the Harlem Renaissance, and really all the way up until integration, you had people having some sense of control over their community, right? And a relative sense of agency. So and I'm trying to think of this woman's name. I was about to look it up. But during Prohibition, for example, you know, people weren't allowed to go to buy alcohol or go to clubs or anything like that. She had her own speakeasy, right? Where people from the community came together, you know, illegally, but they came together, you know, they got their bubbly on, you know, listened to some music, and the community was there all together, right? Now, art was there, the people were there, the ownership was there, right? What we have now, and because you talked about the tenant things in Harlem, and that's true. But back then, more people owned their homes, and they passed on their homes to their children. Right? There was more ownership. You go to the Black community, people had their own restaurants, their own food carts. Right? Now, the Black community, it's all tenants. Right? There's hardly any ownership. Right? We might have one or two stores, but we don't, like you say, like buy the block. That's a thing that people have to consciously do now. So I think back then they weren't really conscious of the power of that, right? We talk about, you know, Black Wall Street in Oklahoma, but the thing was there were Black Wall Streets everywhere, right? We had Black neighborhoods that everything was owned by Black folks. And when we're talking about nation building, that's what's necessary. Now, nation building is almost an abstract thought because there is no ownership. And I'm not saying we need to have ownership over America, but it's hard to organize when you're always asking for things, right? And the things you ask have to be given, and usually given by the people that don't want to give it to you.
Appreciate that, Tariq. Toya.
So I'll probably take a little different perspective. If I'm looking back at that time and even pre that time, so artistry is something Black people do. That's who we are. You know what I'm saying? So one of the issues is we give it away for free a lot of times because it's just who we are, right? And then they put a price tag on it. And then because we didn't know the value of healing somebody through music, like we really don't get that. But it's kind of what Courtney was speaking to earlier. In indigenous cultures, everybody don't get to sing. Everybody don't get to put on the show because of the spiritual nature that is trying to come because of the cultural components of things, right? So when you're trying to develop culture as a slave, you're going to typically create those same kind of experiences. And so in the Harlem Renaissance, what you get definitely is ownership, but then we talk about, well, who owned the spaces, right? Back to earlier about how do we create spaces for everyone? So when you're talking about Du Bois, you can't talk about Du Bois, you don't necessarily talk about Langston Hughes. You can't talk about, most of the gay and lesbians own most of the clubs. So in a community where we're segregated and we don't see each other's contribution and how is over time has hurt us, particularly with artists, because who's running the art scene, right? Creatives, people that are, into producing things, providing experiences, that's spiritual in nature, right? So again, Black people just never think I need to put a price tag on that. I want to have a space to be able, that's why we pay for churches, because I want a space to be able to have ritual. However, we program that ritual. That's why we pay to go to the club, because that's a ritualistic experience where we're able to express ourselves in a certain way. So as we look at freeing artists and we're looking at creators and innovators, I think it is that conversation of history. Like, what is the purpose of dance, for example, right? What is the purpose of singing? Again, if I'm looking at Egypt or Kemet, so to speak, if I say, hey, this was the greatest civilization on earth, right? We all learned this. I'm saying they didn't they had a whole priesthood. You had to spend years in something before you actually went out and produced something. But in this culture where we're trying to survive and we're awakening individually, right? And then, hey, here's an opportunity because they will accept the this portion of it because it heals them too, right? Healing is healing. So I think as we move forward, getting people who are healers in a form of expression, creativity, like that's fun to watch people acting. Like that's the healing thing for community. We have to value that differently, I think. I don't necessarily think hip hop has helped. I'm a hip hop advocate in terms of I have a certain popular connection to myself. But if I'm a critical person, artist wise, it didn't help us because you didn't have to perfect this. You didn't have to perfect that. When Cicely Tyson them, they could sing, they could dance, they could act, they could do comedy, they could do 4 or 5 things. So the whole artistry piece where you could take care of yourself and be self-sufficient, we don't have that because in that talented 10th, we say, well, hey, I'm gonna take this talent, I'm gonna ride this out because of the financial, right? And then we left all of the other things, like where's the infrastructure past your $1 million? Where's the infrastructure for the upcoming artists? Where's the infrastructure for the new business people? Right? We didn't necessarily do that. So I think we have an opportunity to fix those things by understanding, oh, we just missed a few steps and we need to account for that operationally in the community to keep safe spaces for people to continue to do this type of thing.
Okay, thank y'all. Then I have another question. Well, it gives background and then it's a question at the end. The Harlem Renaissance was a melting pot for Black people across the diaspora. A new sense of belonging came from artifacts found by Great Britain as they aimed to colonize Northern Africa. Many Black people relearned their history past slavery. Coupled with the migrations from West Indies and many southern cities across the country, the square blocks of Harlem showed various stories of Blackness. Taking the individual and familial trauma that each person, each family brought with them, adding culture, spice, and a sense of collective history, a great literary and art movement emerged. How can we become more global in our education approach, not sticking to one paradigm in what it means to be educated? So how do we shift from just having like just one type of paradigm that we learn from, which I would assume would be in a lot of ways a Eurocentric paradigm.
Can you define for us what you mean when you say Eurocentric paradigm?
I'm thinking about what informs like our knowledge. Like when we're thinking about the paradigm, what informs a Eurocentric knowledge, or what does it mean to have knowledge? Where do these ideas come from? Like to say that an example of what is actually history from a Eurocentric perspective. They tell us our history in a certain way, which we know has been obfuscated, is lies, is not the total truth. We know these are lies, but if we actually tap into like a different paradigm, let's say an Afrocentric paradigm, then we're restoring that agency back to African people to tell our own stories, to tell it in an elucidated way. We're not like, oh, we only were ever slaves, and it's like, no, people actually had their own civilizations, they had their own cultures. So thinking about how can we shift away from lies in a sense? How do we recenter ourselves in our own education as people of African descent, where we're not speaking of ourselves as non-humans? Because from a Eurocentric perspective, we are. They see us as non-human, but from an Afrocentric perspective, we know we had a sense of agency at a time.
So can I answer and then I'll be quiet?
Yeah, yeah.
It's a real simple conversation. We say it loud. I'm Black and I'm proud. We don't have another movement like that. We don't have anything that connects us in terms of music, energy. Like you see these various things culturally that are coming out, but the expression of Blackness, you bring in the West Indies. I'm in Arkansas, for example. In certain areas, they may not ever meet a person from the West Indies, right? So how do we increase the diversity among the community, right? In terms of, because we all have different palates. Some of us like Jamaican food. Some of us like, you know what I'm saying, African-American soul food. Some of us like Chinese food even. I'm a Chinese because we have roots in all of these places. So not understanding that dynamic sometimes keeps us limited. But I think we have to create a movement. Like you said, how do we move forward? I was almost like, say it loud, I'm Black and I'm proud. And then how do you push that across the schools, in the homes, in the spaces that did before to kind of create this movement and this resurgence? You got James Brown out of a perm, right? Like seriously, out of this awareness that I'm Black, you know what I'm saying? And I'm conscious and I need to get this out my head, you know what I mean? So it's the same thing. Good hair with Chris Rock did that with good hair. You saw a lot of Black women taking that off, understanding that I need to share this piece because it's not authentic, it's not healthy. So we have to find these entertainment and music, and it becomes a big part because it's how we move people.
Yeah, you ate that. Yeah, that was great, and definitely, I just want to say, like, definitely thinking about I'm Black and I'm proud. I think a lot of times people look at it in a simple way, but when you said that and when you brought in those examples, it made me think like, no, like it's taking it past what it means to be Black in a Eurocentric framing, but like, no, like I have cultural roots and it doesn't start with y'all. So I really like how you use that example. Okay, Courtney.
I even just want to bounce back off of that because she said with the perm, like, let's unpack the fact that he had a perm in his hair, right? Meaning he put chemicals in his hair to physically straighten it. And nonetheless, he was talking about Black empowerment. He was telling people to sit within their embodied self when in fact, there were ways in which he wasn't. And I think that there's so much complexity in that, right? There's so much nuance. And when I thought about existing outside of a singular paradigm, I thought about nuance, right? I was talking a lot about pushing back against the lies that is history. And I think a part of that is understanding the sweet lullaby that is Eurocentric learning. I think that's a really good metaphor for it, right? Like, it's a sweet lullaby. It sings us to sleep and we're comfortable and it feels nice and it'll get us to that talented 10th part of the ladder. But at the same time, we have to think about the nightmares that it's producing for us. And I'll leave the analogy at that.
Yeah, that was good. Tariq.
Peace. So I think the question, the end part is sticking out to me, this idea of a singular paradigm. And the issue is not that there is a singular paradigm, is that we are operating from a dislocated paradigm, right? The Eurocentric one that is not authentic to our perspective, to our culture, to our ancestors, right? If Black people operated from a singular Afrocentric paradigm that was incorporating all the experiences and cultures that are part of this paradigm, there would be no problem. We would be located within our own culture, right? But with an understanding that there are other cultural paradigms that are in existence, and we respect, other people's perspectives. Right now, the issue is that there is a hegemony over the European, or there's a premium, I should say, over the Eurasian perspectives of history and culture. The other part of this has to do with, we're talking about, the Harlem Renaissance and the boys and all them. Sorry, my cat's attacking me at the moment. Now you got me confused what I'm talking about. But we're talking about the paradigm, right? And people like yourself, Courtney, Toya, we have been able to take advantage of these opportunities, go to school, learn what a paradigm is, read a book, find out all the different nuances in culture. Not only do not a lot of people have those opportunities, but sometimes that's not how people learn, right? It's sometimes people have to go and see and have conversations with people to have certain realizations and epiphanies. That's something that happened with the boys. It's something that happened with many of the other people during Harlem Renaissance, traveling around the world, talking to other Black people around the world, seeing that their experiences and their perspectives are not that different, right? The vast majority of people in our community don't have the opportunity to travel and talk to other Black people from around the world, right? And we know that kind of people, actually, I'm not going to go there, but if we can help create programs and programming that gets people moving, right? Get people moving outside their states, outside their cities, talking with other people from this African paradigm, we're really going to be able to open people's minds, right? Because we can go and talk about Egypt being Black, this, and this, and people may or may not take it. But you go to Egypt and you show them the Black faces carved in stone from over 5,000 years ago, there is no denying, right? You take them to East Africa, you show them the great stone cities or the villages of the people who live in the hinterlands, and you talk to them and they say, well, these people, they call their mothers the same thing we call our mothers, right? They have the same relationship with their grandmothers that we have. They're neighbors. They love them the same way that we love them. That's something that's uniquely African. We are African people too. So, and that goes hand in hand with both my sisters today were saying, right? This idea of I'm Black and I'm proud, right? Let's put the Africa back in Black. You know what I'm saying? Because we're not just a color. We come from a people. We come from a history, a place, and all these things are going to reinforce what it means to be a Black person, an African person to us. One of the issues with education right now, why a lot of people have a hard time getting into education is because they read all these things, especially history. They read history, and these little Black kids don't care about George Washington or Benjamin Franklin, right? Why do they care about them? Some of the local people here in Philadelphia, they say they're told those are their founding fathers, but those are not our founding fathers. To us, those are the founding fathers, the people who molested our ancestors, right? So why would they care? But you start to make this history, this education apply to them, they're going to get a little bit more invested. You know what I'm saying?
All right, thanks for that, Tariq. Yeah, that was good, especially just being a teacher. I definitely, and being a student once before myself, I see how uninvested I was in learning about history because it didn't have anything to do with me. So you have to place people in their own, in their own history. So I definitely appreciate that. And my last question for y'all is, how can we reimagine what it means to be educated? Courtney.
First of all, I really love this question just because I think there is such a finite understanding of what we perceive to be education and educated. And I think under the Eurocentric lens of education, often who is pedestalized as being educated is often a white cis het male, right? So there's gender and sexuality implications to that, of course. But I often really, especially with my peers, like to complicate that notion. I always like to tell people in my opinion, the most educated person right now, as we speak, is a Black person locked away behind bars. Because I think it completely makes us revamp the education system. And people are like, what? Locked behind bars? That makes no sense. But it makes so much sense, because that Black body locked behind bars, it really holds so many systems of power accountable. Because if that person is the most educated and their potential is not being tapped into, well, we have to ask ourselves, how did that happen? What was left behind, or what parts of their being was left behind that got them locked away to begin with, right? And I think that redistribution of power that pedestalizes a Black body as the most educated really centers itself within ways of knowing of Afrocentricity, much to what Tariq was talking about before, but it also, again, dismantles systems of oppression that has relegated this Black body to be imprisoned and ultimately subhuman in many ways, which I think is so important for a lot of people in this audience who may be in predominantly white institutions, and you conceive your white male peer to be more intelligent than you. Well, that's not the case, especially if we're looking from an Afrocentric vantage point.
Thank you, Courtney. Tariq.
I also appreciate this question. I think to be educated, right? I guess this is almost cliche at this point, but it's to know yourself, right? And not only to know yourself, but to be able to articulate who you are, right? And be able to defend who you are, right? And I think that's one of the major issues. You go back to Carter G. Woodson, the miseducation of the Negro, right? Because the issue is not even that people aren't educated, it's that we're miseducated, right? And so people are confused about this, that, and the other, who they are, where they come from. And so to have that clarity is going to really, it's going to move mountains for us, right? When people are united in spirit and understanding of who they are, that's when we can actually start to see progress as a community, because we're going to be on the same page and we're going to be working together, and we're not going to be fighting over basic things that should have been dealt with 100 years ago, like who our ancestors were, right? So I think to be educated is to be grounded, right? If you're not grounded in anything, I don't think you can call yourself educated, and I think without being grounded, without being clear, we're open to manipulation. We're open to or the process of miseducation continuing, right? So I don't think if you're not grounded, I don't think you can even call yourself educated. And there's people who go through decades of education in these academies and these institutions, and they're still not grounded, right? They're still confused on who they are, confused on how they relate to their people. So for me, that's where it starts. And I know so many people in the community. I talked about the people from ASCAC. Those are grounded people. They know who they are. They do study groups together, right? Many of them haven't been to universities, but they get together. If they don't read together, they talk together, right? They're very clear on on who they are, what they understand, right? A lot of these people who, especially on the internet, they'll tell you, we come from, we're Native Americans, or we're lost Hebrews, or we're so many different things, but they can't back that up in anything, right? That's not education. That's miseducation, for a lack of better words. I guess I'm going to end there because I'm about to go on a huge tangent. But to be grounded, right? To be clear, to be in communication with the traditions of our ancestors. To me, that's being educated.
Okay, and Toya.
So the energy culturally for our people that have dealt with education is an energy, a feminine energy. It's the moon energy. It's the energy that cultivates us, right? So education is about drawing out the best in people. That's how I look at education. So I think we talked about revolution earlier. I think it starts in education and not just in the institution. If I've gotten your child at 7 years old, and we are having issues with finding out, what works for you learning style, is so much more difficult for that teacher that has to sit in that classroom with 30 other people. So understanding that at home there's an education, in community there should be an education, in our social organizations there are educational, because you're giving social norms and practices, right? Some of us come here to be healers. We may not ever go to a school. You may have gotten that through, seriously, I know people that through ancestral, whatever, they never had to go to school, they're self-taught, and God bless them that way. To most people in a Eurocentric way, that's not normal, right? There's no way we could be that sophisticated. But it goes back to what Courtney was saying. In a traditional lens, I want more of those people on my team, that I want people that can actually do other things, because that energy is a lot more, is valued and is more powerful for the long term of the community. So understanding that we all don't have the same purpose. And if we have people who said, hey, I'm going to be responsible for educating the community and whatever, let's give them support, right? And then let's sit and say, hey, as a community, what are we teaching? And is the curriculum working, right? I went to school and went to college in Texas. Well, they build all your textbooks in Texas. They're not interested in teaching you nothing. So, you know what I'm saying? So having these understanding that everything has a business. Teaching is a business, academia is a business, and then who runs the business, who makes the decisions on the business. And that's the piece where, if you're taking a Du Bois and a Booker T. Washington, I'm saying, y'all, we got to figure this out, because there is a production piece to what's happening to Black people, right? And the production piece does come in educational institutions. If you go to college, high school, that's 12 years, seven years of your life of being indoctrinated with a certain way to behave. You need to get up at this time, you need to eat at this time, you need to do this and that. So that's a socialization practice, which is educating us on how to work, right? Because you're gonna go to work and do the same thing. You're gonna get up at this time, you're gonna do. So it's all a process that's teaching you from one stage of life to the other, to be able to quote unquote be civilized and to behave properly. Black people have never entered the conversation. Matter of fact, we've never thought to have a conversation by ourselves to say, do we need to do an 8-hour workday? Do we need to do a 5-hour? Do we need to do any of this? Does that work best for us? Because in Asia, they cutting out at 1, 2 o'clock. They don't care. They're going to shut it down and they're going to do what they need to do. We don't feel empowered to do that. And then because we don't manage and really own our institutions, we can't. So again, if we're talking about education, I'm saying let's find as many teachers and educators and people that's serious. Again, don't have to go to college. We did study groups. We was in college. I never learned anything in college. I learned about life in college. I learned how to make friends in college. I learned how to put on events in college. So how can we take these experiences that we're having and use them as really the educational experience? Because as the professors know, a lot of times you're mentoring kids. They there to do their work. If you don't do your work, I can't help you. Right? So education is that. We have to do the work. So what is the work is the conversation, because what we've been working on, somehow it didn't get us there, right? So because we was talking about Du Bois 100 plus years later, right? Who was a highly educated man. And the whole essay was about it, was directed at educators, right? So we need to figure out in the leadership. So this is a great conversation. It's a great time because we are going through a resurgence of who we are. We're going through another one of those 60 kind of movements where we're trying to find ourselves. And I'm saying, let's broaden our perspective. Tariq is absolutely correct. We're all African in nature. So what does that mean? That means not all of us is going to sit up here dressed pretty like the white, like that's not who we are, right? And how do we create that space for all of us to express ourselves freely? So that's the education. I think we start with acceptance.
Thank you so much for that, Toya. That was, I mean, everything y'all have said this whole time is just y'all dropping gems, and it's definitely putting a lot of things into perspective. That was actually our last question. I know we started a few minutes behind, so we're past 7. Do we have time for any questions, Wesley?
Yeah, I'm good as long as everybody else is good. Keyshawn, if you want to ask that question,
I can.
yeah.
Okay. So we'll have time for maybe 2 to 3 questions. So feel free to add those in the chat box. I'll read Keyshawn's. He said, in a world where material is always taught from a Eurocentric perspective, or we are raised to learn based off Eurocentric values, where does one begin with wanting to learn from an Afrocentric perspective? For example, in regards to education, We can say or recommend going to an HBCU, but what happens when the HBCU has Eurocentric teachings? Ooh. We unlearn behaviors or teachings we are taught. What happens next? With our history being banned day by day and it gets harder to research the roots of our actual history, how do we combat that? And anybody could address that from the panel.
I'm gonna let the two professors instruct that because that's what they do every day.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. If you know the history of HBCUs, which ones were called Negro colleges, there's actually a book that was written on this. It's called The White Architects of Black Education. So a lot of these institutions were created just to educate Black people on how to be better workers. Like Sister Toya was saying, you're sitting there, you're being obedient, you learn how to work, you go into the workplace. And there's a current struggle. I think Howard was, we saw that struggle boil over this year, where the culture of the students and even some of the professors is not matching the culture of the administration, right? The administrators want to be basically overseers, right? The institution itself is a white institution for Black people, right? Which is what I would recommend to anyone, if you're going into education through these institutions, or if you just want to do it on your own, is don't follow the institution, follow the master teachers, right? The master teachers, the ones who care, are going into the community and making sure that they're taking what they're learning there and bringing it to the community, right? That's one of the reasons why John Henrik Clarke is so beloved, right? Not because of his work in the university, but because of what he did in the community. He was giving back to everyone. Same thing with Malcolm. Actually, Malcolm X was good friends with John Henrik Clarke. When Malcolm X wrote the Constitution, so the Organization of African American Unity, John Henrik Clarke helped pin that, right? Same thing, you could talk about Milana Karenga is still alive. He's still, currently all these things are on YouTube, so that's free. But they still have their publications. They go on tour. They talk to people. So you have John Henrik Clarke. It has transitioned. He's an ancestor now, but you still have Milana Karenga. You still have Molefe Kete Asante. You have people like who's still around? Dr. Leonard Jeffries is still around and active in New York. Um, Anthony Browder is still around, taking people to Egypt. People are around, right? And look for those teachers and see what they can teach you, right? Maybe their perspective is not what you're looking for, but there's more people out here who have these perspectives that they can share with you. And be, go when you have the opportunity, take care of those opportunities, take advantage of those opportunities, but don't let the opportunity to take these opportunities dictate how you're going to approach education and approach your culture. Let's see, there's a question. I understand that your point is that most HBCUs are in it, but you have to have a better opportunity to learn art history at HBCU. Not necessarily. So let me explain that. So at an HBCU, for example, and this is one of the struggles at Howard University, right? This is actually the reason why I didn't go to Howard University, because they have the people who want to teach you this history, right? But they don't have the infrastructure necessarily to teach you. So you can, for undergrad, when you're going to get your bachelor's degree, that's fine, right? That wasn't a question. Okay, but let me finish. So when you go to these programs, right? If you want to study our culture, right? You want a degree in Black Studies. Most HBCUs don't have programs in Black Studies. They say we have sociology, we have history, we have these things. These are white disciplines, right? And they're going to teach you. Maybe the teacher who's vested will spin it in such a way, but there's not a PhD awarding program at any HBCU that is focused on Black experiences, right? I'm gonna move this cat. But part of the issue is that the instructors, like you have Dr. Gray Carr, Dr. Mario Beatty, Dr. Valencia Watkins, they are fighting to have these things recognized by the university, but the university does not see the purpose. They say we're Black people, it doesn't matter. Go study these white disciplines. So what's important at these HBCUs is the culture that's there. But in terms of the institutional academic programs, they are not there. And that's not the fault of the students. It's not the fault of the faculty. It's the fault of the institution.
Tariq, I think you made so much fantastic points. And I think your cat may be the best panelist we have on here, honestly.
Don't tell her that.
But I wanted to say, in agreement with what you've already been saying in terms of HBCUs, that not only do they not have these disciplines, but a lot of their top scholars are going to predominantly white institutions to teach as well, right? So they have these profound scholars who are coming out and producing all of these amazing works, and then they go to teach at predominantly white institutions as well. So, and it's because the programs exist there, right? They have the Black studies there. So there's that portion. And then I also think that at HBCUs, when you have students who study, for example, sociology, some of them then go on to predominantly white institutions to attain higher degrees. And then unfortunately, they're reproducing Eurocentric ways of knowing because that's what these departments predicate themselves on. Maybe it didn't predicate themselves on that foundation at the HBCU, but when they move on to the predominantly white institution, then in many ways, they're replicating Eurocentric ideologies and in many ways becoming cogs in these systems of oppression. But to the earlier question, I also wanted to add that a lot of learning happens outside of the classroom. And so when you aren't given that sustenance from what you might be learning, and if you feel like you're being given Eurocentric information, I think it's really important to explore the multitude of publications, books, etc., that exist, but may not be pushed in the academy because there's intentionality to why you don't hear about those books, right? It goes back to that miseducation point that was made earlier in terms of Carter G. Woodson and things like that.
Actually, I do have something to say, KJ.
So go ahead.
Yeah, so me and Wesley have this debate all the time, right? And as I stated, I think this is the complexity of the talented 10. We're back to the beginning, right? So what becomes the best path based upon where we are? And I think that's an individual conversation. Whether I'm in a white institution or a Black one, I got limitations. That's just the truth. How do we accommodate for those limitations? We as a community have to take responsibility for ourselves. That's something, whether we go to their schools or not, we have not taken responsibility for our history because we don't own it. Most of it is in museums and in spaces that they own and control. So we haven't, as a community, seen it as something of value. So I'm going to say this again, I'm into a revolution for educators because the educators have the biggest challenge because, like you said, you're dealing with administrators that really don't want it to happen. Right, for whatever reason, white, Black, and different, they still fighting with a school I went to try to get a real Black studies class they've been promising for 15 years because of either, they'll say I can't find the right candidates, right? It's this whole hodgepodge of things that administrators do in these environments to keep information out, whether they're consciously doing it or not. So my thing is, how do we help people in education? How do we create these libraries? How do we do that so our people have access to information and you have someone like an Anthony Broader that sits with the young people so they can get educated properly. Like, it's so much we could do through programming by really just having elders and people who do have that hands-on experience that you're talking about. Most people never get access to these people. Like, you don't know about Anthony Broader if you're not in the DMV area or you're not up 95. You don't really know who Anthony Broader is, maybe in Atlanta. I just know him because he was one of my frat brothers and the alphas love to bring him down, right? So it became that kind of thing. And you get this broad base of information and it blows your mind because you didn't know all this stuff about Black people. So I think we have a global issue because our history is global. And we need to figure out how to help HBCUs. We need to figure out how to help PWI students, people who are not in school. We got to figure that piece of it out. Let's get the right information to the people and let them study. So I'm done. I'm off my soapbox.
All right, y'all. Thank you so much for that, y'all. That was definitely some great dialogue. I think we really don't have much time for any more questions, but I do see one. So do you not support our HBCUs? If not, you Aiden, um, usurping the little power we do have to educate. Change that scenario. Did you want to respond to that, Tariq?
Yeah, no, it's not that we don't support the HBCUs. Um, and that's actually the point is we support the HBCUs in what they should be doing, right?
Right.
We are calling for them to have the same radical insurgency that, well, the insurgency is there. The students are there. They're fighting. They want to study their own culture, right? And so we're demanding. We're not being complacent with what the little handouts that we get. We're saying we want change. We want them to insert Black Studies programs. If you installed, if we could have a PhD awarding program at a handful of HBCUs,
We would be there.
we wouldn't need a Temple University. We
Yeah.
wouldn't be black folks going to Harvard. We could do our own thing, right? But right now, the perspective is not about training Black folks to be revolutionary Black folks to create our own communities. It's about training Black folks to come into America and be good workers. And it's the same mentality that has been around for the last 200 years. Um, Actually, when there's a group of Temple students, it was Dr. Valentia Watkins, Dr. Greg Carr, Kamanthi Carr, and Dr. Mario Beatty. When they left Temple University, they said, we are going to go to Howard, a Black university, and we're going to turn this into the center of Afrocentric discourse as it should be. And Melepe Kete Asante said, please do, go ahead, that's what needs to happen. It's been 20 years since that. They called themselves the New Jack Scholars. It's been 20 years since they did that. Dr. Greg Kamanthi Carr has stepped down from the chair position because every single year he was being beat up by the administration. They told him, they said, we like that you're getting the students all excited to take these classes, but we sure wish you didn't wear those daishikis on campus, right? That's the mentality that we need to change. We can't, I don't support neo-colonial institutions, right? I support African institutions.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Tariq. If we have no more questions, I would like to thank everyone. I would definitely like to thank our panelists, our brilliant panelists. Y'all did a really great job, and I think a lot of us have something to take away from this. And also, I think all of us could take some type of responsibility away from this. How can we leave this conversation with something to go into our respective communities and give back, or to start different conversations? So I appreciate y'all, and I'm going to give it back over to Wesley.
So before y'all leave, I need everybody to agree to come back. And me and Toya talk about this all the time, but KJ, Courtney, and Tariq, just talking about the need for, because even when you talk about the Harlem Renaissance, you talk about a lot of people coming, like we said, from the West Indies, down south, for whatever reason, out east. So today, when you just think about those cultural places, those places that actually hold history, a lot of those places are underground for various reasons, whether it be funding, it was just the lack of outreach to just broader communities. So the need for actually thinking of like the what was the movement, the where the students got on the bus and went all across the country, that kind of thing currently. So yeah, we need to connect out east with down south, out west to the West Indies, the Freedom Riders, right? So yeah, the need for that is prevalent. So let's keep up with this conversation. But thank you, KJ. Thank you, Toy. Thank you, Courtney. Thank you, Tariq. And thank you, everybody who joined. We need to keep this conversation going. And y'all, please join us again Sunday at 6 o'clock. We're going to be talking about West Africa, pre-slavery, pre-colonization, talking about gold scholars and just that whole movement. We have one of my favorite professors, Dr. Kathenji. So y'all make sure to be back, and we are out.
All right, y'all. Well, that is the end of today's program, and we will see y'all tomorrow.
All right, peace.
All right.